all of these.
I do. Okay.
Okay.
And are these more or do
Rex's piles, so he can keep them all together.
Thank you.
And then and I'll get you that template too. It's in, okay, I'll put the details in the house. Yeah, so if you come just to. I'll try this one first.
Christine? Hello. Hello. How are you?
That way everybody has visited up to this meeting.
Okay, we can go ahead and start the
I was gonna say
recording.
day, but it's been a week and and a half. So are these duplicates?
You have to fill out one each meeting, I think.
Those are the same I just signed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. we got it back.
Don't want to sign them twice.
But there should be one for today.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, welcome to our commission meeting this afternoon. It's nice to see your faces. As Governor Cox eased the mandate in state buildings as of the 15th of this month. And it's good to know that you're comfortable having been vaccinated to show your face in public. So we're delighted to have all of you with us. Where are we?
It's still not to being screened yet,
Yes.
because it's not.
Yeah, YouTube is streaming. So, but when we turn off the, there we go. Perfect. Now let's see if I can find what happened to the video stream. Well, the good news is I'm seeing some of our panelists. What I'm not seeing is us. So, Moira, you're still seeing me? Because I've lost the video feed.
Just seeing Jeffrey and Daniel.
Okay. I seem to have lost video feed.
Yeah, and Jason's camera is on.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Well,
Turned on.
the owl was turned on. Let me unplug it and plug it back in.
Now I see Jason, so I see three people. The owl is flashing red. Is that to be plugged in to charge?
It is plugged in. Okay. Minor technical difficulties, apparently. There. Now we have the video. There. All right, apologize for the technical delays, but looks like we've got video working, and hopefully our panelists can hear us. Because if panelists can hear it, that means that the public on YouTube can also hear it. So we want to make an introduction today. We have a new administrative assistant for the commission. Ali Escobar is with us. And we're delighted to have her. She'll be helping, among other things, with the minutes, which is a good opportunity. So Ali, if you could just very briefly tell us a little bit about yourself so the commissioners can get to know you.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Ali Escobar. I was born and raised in Mexico City. We came here when I was 14. I graduated from the University of Utah back in 2017 with a bachelor's degree in political science. And I got to intern for the Utah Department of Higher Education in 2017 as well. And I have 2 kids actually. And I quit my previous employment to come work for you. And I'm happy to be here and honored to be with you.
Well, welcome.
Thank
We're
you.
delighted to have you as part of our team.
Spanish, excellent. So come across any of that.
All right, the next item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes. There is one correction that we need to make to the minutes to reflect that Brian Nalder has been acting as counsel. So we'll reflect that in the minutes. Are there any other changes or corrections to the minutes that any of you saw?
I move we approve as for that suggested change.
Okay, so motion to move, second. Any discussion? All in favor? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you very much. We had down as a potential action item, discussion on general counsel. I know the committee has met and has started reviewing the packets. I don't know if y'all would like to say anything else, Commissioner Durham?
Well, let me just report that we spent our first time together getting educated by Christopher Jennings, thank you. I knew it was CJ, but on how to use the scoring system and how to review the proposals. I will admit that that appears to have gone in one year and out the other. I cannot access the scoring things. I press the packet and it says I have to get permission, and then I get permission, and I don't know where I go with permit. Did that happen to you? You got
down
through
at
it
the very
there.
bottom, there are two different things, but they're
Right.
actually not different.
Okay, I'll see if I
So-
can get over that hurdle.
And once you get it, it took me a long time to realize all three scorings were in one document,
Oh,
because I was duplicating documents trying to.
well, see, I'm glad I waited because now I know the secrets. I know Commissioner Thorne has submitted his final scoring, and Lyle, have you caught up yet?
I did. I sent mine
Oh,
Okay.
to
boy.
you and Gordon yesterday.
Okay, so
Gordon
I
Jennings.
am the sole failure of our training session. And before I leave, I'll sit down with you and we
Yeah,
will.
we'll go through, and we have the rest this week, so I want you to
Okay, good.
take the time to make sure we do a good job.
Okay, good. I have a list of excuses, but they're worthless.
Save them for when you
For
really
more
need them.
important.
Mr. Durham did better than I did. He didn't even get my ear.
Well,
So,
I sat in on both your sessions and I still had trouble.
yeah, and I have to say, I have reviewed the proposals, and I, for one, I haven't seen your scoring conclusions yet, but I, for one, was really pleased with the quality. We didn't get very many, but the quality was generally pretty impressive. So I think when we settle on one of the proposals, we will be in good shape.
Good.
So we'll have a final report, I would assume. Well,
So what we
when all
may,
the scoring's in,
Sure.
maybe I'll do a little summary and send that to the commissioners. Would that be the?
yeah, I think that would be helpful. And then what we will try and do is so that on the 8th, we can actually have them, here with us.
Oh,
If we have it done prior to that,
okay.
we'll call an electronic meeting, and Gordon and I'll, be here at our host location. What's the technical term? Our anchor location. So that we can do it without me having to pledge my firstborn, although she is here. So
And soon to leave the state, so you can't pledge for very long.
exactly.
I see that there are two contracts. Is there a prohibition to one firm doing both?
No.
Okay, that's something I did not understand.
Mr. Chair, I'll just express my frustration. When I looked at them, there were a lot more areas of judging I would like to have said. It was a very limited area. For example, one proposal wanted to bring an outside law professor in, which I thought was a great idea. The other had somebody had some experience in the Arizona redistricting that. The third one was a rather small firm, kind of biased towards small firms. I mean, my own experience as a lawyer has been that I have clients come in all the time from Logan who go to these big law firms in Salt Lake and say, every time we call, it costs us $300. We get a different attorney every time, have to explain our cases, and then we have to drive down and meet with them. So I found that sometimes smaller firms can focus more and get you what you need than a big firm with a bunch of different people. So they're all different. I agree with what Commissioner Durham said. Any one of the three. Good.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your feedback, and that will hopefully help us not us, although it will help us, but it will also help the commissions that come after us as we learn from the processes that we take. Any other questions from the rest of the commissioners on this issue, council? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have some very interesting people joining us today. And so I will put them up on the screen, assuming that that part works again. When all else fails, unplug and replug in the technology, right?
Reboot dummy.
It took me years to learn that.
I forget it all the time.
What's that?
So just for our panelists, we're trying to get you projected up on the monitors in the room so the rest of them can see you. And I'm not the only one who has the opportunity to look at you. Let me. It was obviously working before we started. Yeah, we're going to restart that and see if that solves it for us. So unplugging.
My daughter did.
Yeah,
My daughter did parts of her school year with an owl, so I understand the frustration at times.
Jacob, shall we try it on your computer?
I think we need to keep press on some shows, right?
Well, yeah, but it's not recognizing it here.
Sure.
Yeah. So. Here. Let me plug that in. We'll try and see if it works on Jacob's computer to get you all up on the monitor. Apologize for the delay.
Maybe what we could do is have the first presenter introduce himself.
Sure.
His experience.
So we have two very interesting presenters that joining us, each of whom have extensive experience with redistricting across many states. They also have a party identification that they're most affiliated with, although they both try and play straight, if you will. And so we have Jeff Weiss and Jason Torchinsky, who are here with us. They're now up on the screen. So Jeff, if I could get you to briefly introduce yourself, and then after you're done, we'll get Jason to introduce himself, and then I'll turn the time over to the two of you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having us this afternoon for you and very early evening where we are on the East Coast. My name is Jeff Weiss, and this is my fifth redistricting cycle. I've started back in New York in the 1980 cycle when New York lost 5 congressional districts. And at a very young age, I was thrown into the catbird seat and having to figure out how to deal with it. I've since gone on to work in nearly every state across the country, mostly identified, as the chair said, as a Democrat, but somebody who believes in redistricting as a building block and pillar of our democracy. In my years working on redistricting, I recently co-edited and co-authored the Redistricting Red Book published by the National Conference of State Legislatures. and I teach redistricting, census, and voting rights law at New York Law School in New York City, and have a national practice working on redistricting for elected officials, state and local governments. So it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'll have some perspectives to share after Jason introduces himself, and we'll see where the evening takes us. Jason?
Well, thank you. Thank you. So my name's Jason Torchinsky. I'm a partner at Holtzman, Vogel, Barron, Josefiak, and Torchinsky in Washington, D.C. and Haymarket, Virginia. This is my third redistricting cycle, so Jeff beats me by a few years. Started out in the 2000 cycle, sort of shortly after the data was released. I was at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. And then in the 2010 cycle, represented a number of individuals across the country and legislatures across the country as that redistricting cycle was going through, and have been sort of regularly involved in all of the preparations up to and including this cycle, and a whole lot of litigation over the last 10 years on various redistricting subjects. I've represented legislatures and legislators across the country, and represented states across the country in redistricting related cases in federal and state courts.
Okay, so should I start first?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, I think what attracted Jason and me to speak with you tonight was when we realized that we both are members of law firms with partisan biases, so to speak, and might not have made it past the starting gate, but thought that we still had something to share. And a former legislator mutual friend put me in touch with the chair. We had a conversation or two. So here we are tonight to present really our unique perspective as Democratic and Republican attorneys steeped in redistricting and experienced across the country, but a few of the perspectives that we have on the process. You're at the beginning now of a new redistricting cycle in Utah, where Utah has a unique opportunity to be one of the first commission states in the country with a, so to speak, tie-breaking member, not an even body, to recommend a plan to the state legislature. Now, even though the state legislature can, reject your plan, your task really should be where you can work together in a bipartisan nature to really set the record for how a fair commission could operate. Now, I served as counsel to the California Senate when that state's first redistricting process was undertaken by a completely independent commission that did not report to the legislature. In Arizona, it's more of a partisan process there, driven by the appointees and the political parties where they come, with separate counsel, Democrats and Republicans. Other states have different types of systems. I come originally from New York, which has an advisory commission that reports to the legislature that can scrap whatever plans the commission sends and do what it wants. So you're really at the cutting edge now of being able to be a first commission in 2021 to deal with fairness, deal with an equitable plan that balances the criteria, in state law, and have the legislature approve it. Now, my work has mostly been in legislatures and commissions, although I have litigated. That's not my specialty. I work more at the strategic end with the line drawers on strategy, on process, on law, on getting a legitimate plan to, through the process that would withstand any kind of court challenge. And my approach has always been to use objective criteria, preferably ranked or prioritized criteria, robust public outreach, a transparent and open process, never hiding anything or doing anything, so to speak, cute, and to build a very solid record and document how each district you draw is based on the law. I started 30 some odd years ago in Virginia, where we actually talked through 100 districts one by one during House floor debate to explain why districts 1, 2, 3 were all constitutional and legal. And there was a legal challenge afterwards. And using the legislative record or commission record that we developed, the court looked to see that each district did in fact meet some kind of criteria. So I'll just throw out a few things you ought to be thinking of during the process so that you too can create that kind of a plan that would get approval from the legislature and withstand any court challenge should one arise. So on data and criteria, the first thing that many states are looking at now is what data do you use? And my recommendation that is, although the data will be late, that you really stick strictly to the Public Law 94-171 data and not go off using a different database as a few other states, Idaho, Colorado, Oklahoma, Illinois recently have tinkered with the data a little bit, partly because of deadlines and schedules, but opening the door to a challenge. You want to make sure that the data that you work with is provided to the public in a very standard, accessible format with shapefiles, with databases, ancillary data that might include information on communities of interest. And you want to make sure that the data is available at every stage of the game for initial plans, draft plans, and final plans. You want to make sure for the criteria, and you do have several criteria in state law: compactness, contiguity, preserving communities of interest, preserving natural boundaries, and nesting districts. But will you be able to explain these criteria to the public so they'll understand it, especially where they're not measured in law by any kind of objective standard? What might be compact or contiguous to me might not be compact or contiguous to you. So you should try to develop as best you can what the parameters are of what a compact or what a contiguous plan might be. One state defines contiguity as a point in land where districts might cross like this, but in the middle there where the X is, that provides for point contiguity. That's just an example to give you. North Carolina did that for many years. Communities of interest is the most up and coming, exciting of the criteria. And it's one of the least defined because it isn't defined. So you need to make sure that people, when they present to you what their communities of interest are, if you can, to try to suggest to them how to define a community of interest, whether it's socioeconomic or racial or ethnic or a college campus community. Try to make sure that they are really uniformly defined. You want to make sure that every time you agree on a district that you provide rationale by objective standards so that a court can review it and take into consideration why it's there and why the commission plan, the state plan, ought to be upheld. You also want to make sure that you provide reports analyzing any kind of racial or partisan impacts, political splits. There are scoring software mechanisms out there for compactness to show, is your district more compact than my district? And these are things courts look to. And one thing on criteria and balancing plans that is really at the cutting edge now, which we didn't have to deal with 10 years ago, are all of the mathematically driven algorithm plans. There are computer systems out there that can automatically draw hundreds, if not thousands, of plans without any human input. Now, I don't advocate that as a place to start from, but once you draw a plan, you can be sure that depending on who's watching the process, who's involved in the process, that your plans will be scored against other plans that are submitted. And should you end up in court, and Jason should know this from cases he's dealt with, a court is going to look at more or less eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which is the narrowest, closest to what our so-called experts think a fair district should be with no question marks around it. That happened in Pennsylvania. It's happened in Illinois years back, where a Republican plan had more precise data than a Democratic plan, and the court said they'd like lower deviation. They have better voting rights districts. They're more compact. They're more contiguous. So point score goes to the Republicans 30 years ago. So you'll be watched. You'll be scored. And these are brand new theories, brand new algorithms we haven't seen before. So welcome to the new world of redistricting there. I'll just finish up with a few words on public participation. You want to make sure that your process is transparent and open to the public at all times. That according under your state law, I believe this meeting is being broadcast. Everything you do should be in the open. Your public hearings, your outreach efforts, you should be doing things before the census data arrives in mid-August. You can use the next month or two for outreach hearings, develop a website, talk to the public, make sure that you do an education and training process. I always suggest that you hold public hearings before the data comes as more or less a listening tour, so you can get a sense of how the state has changed in the last decade. You should have a round of hearings once a draft map, once the data comes out, you're developing a draft map. And one thing you should consider, and this is something that many redistricting bodies don't do, is to hold a hearing before the final plan is announced. All too often, this is more the case in legislatures than commissions. You might spend 10 months developing a plan and hold hearings on it, get public comment on it, but then, 3-4 days, 1 or 2 days before the deadline, a new plan comes out, reported by the committee, by the commission, and then all of a sudden a final vote is taken, it's approved, end of process. And the public had almost no input. Don't let that happen. So you want to make sure also you have a robust informational website where meetings and transcripts, correspondence, other kinds of documents and maps were all made public. And in terms of access, you want to make sure that everybody has access to the software. Make sure that shape files are made available, the data, as I mentioned. I trust you have adequate funding to get all of these things done. We often say in redistricting, never go anywhere without your lawyer. So make sure that you do have legal advice, but make sure that you budget out your timing, because you want to make sure whoever you hire stays with you through the entire process. And if you think there are lawsuits, to make sure that there's someone there to defend the plan, not just at the lawyer end, but at the technical map making end of it as well. And on last note on the maps themselves, make sure that when the public can submit maps, that they can submit not just a complete statewide map, or not just a map that might fit in Citygate or Maptitude software, but maps that anybody can read without being overly technical. So those are just a few of the thoughts I had going into the process. I'm going to be in Salt Lake City. I also serve as the staff chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures Redistricting and Elections Committee, and we're having a national in-person redistricting training session in Salt Lake City, July 14th, 15th, and 16th. I'll be there. I'm doing a session on how to balance criteria effectively when they contradict each other in some circumstances, which you'll probably be finding out. So I'll turn over to the floor to Jason, but in that the two of us have the same perspective as lawyers dedicated to really an honest cause, that we work together. And if there's anything we can do for you down the road, try to consider bipartisan legal assistance, where you put aside the backgrounds, but find where, because there are so few of us in this business, that we know each other, we respect each other, we work together, despite the end game, which is political. But we're not at that point right now. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to just echo pretty much everything Jeff said. I mean, redistricting is just an absolutely fascinating combination of legal and political processes. One of the things that I think is kind of unique in the Utah law is that it's very clear that anybody in the state who wants to file a lawsuit that challenges the ultimate map if it doesn't comply with the criteria basically is authorized and has standing to do it in the statute. So, one of the things is when advising on kind of line drawing, it's our view first as the lawyers is to advise first and foremost on the law, but then also highlight where we've seen clients create political and small p political and public relations issues for themselves as this process goes through. Because as Jeff said, with computers these days and the easy accessibility of GIS software and all different kinds of algorithms and analysis, every plan that you all put forward from your initial draft through amendments through a final plan that you recommend to the legislature, every single thing you do is going to be watched by reporters, by academics, by bloggers with an interest in the area, by interest groups with an interest in the area. And everything you do is going to be fly spec. Jeff recommended, making a lot of things public. One of the things that Jeff and I have both seen over the years, when legislators or commissions don't follow that advice, it ultimately all comes out publicly anyway, because somebody files a lawsuit and then discovery becomes quite invasive, and all of the things that people thought they could hide, turns out they actually can't hide. So that's been my experience in litigating these cases. Nothing remains hidden, and so you might as well just be public and open about it in the first place. So I guess with that, Jeff, I guess you and I are supposed to take questions.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Jason said about disclosure and confidentiality. 30, 40 years ago, when mostly legislators would draw the lines and state constitutions provided legislators with privileges and immunities that were beyond the reach of courts, that's pretty much all gone by the wayside. Federal courts notoriously have erased almost all kinds of confidentiality that legislators try to invoke. Basically, all that isn't discoverable would be a correspondence between a legislator and her or his staffer, and even that could be depending on the topic of it. But almost everything else gets discoverable, and tons of time is spent by the plaintiffs trying to get hold of every single piece of email, no matter how irrelevant they might be. And that drives up an awfully high legal bill, and everything gets discoverable. So just be careful, going back to the old World War II slogan, loose lips sink ships. Anything you say or do will end up, or think of it as ending up in tomorrow's front page news or on TV news that night.
Yep.
Thank you. We have a question or a comment from Commissioner Hilliard.
I have a question, I think, for both of them. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. We heard last meeting from a mathematician who talked about the mathematics of looking at these kind of structures. And something may look very good on paper, but mathematically, as they get into it, it has problems. And something that may look terrible on paper, as you look at it mathematically, it comes out well. How would you suggest we handle that? There's kind of the feeling it's like other things, you can't really define it, and some of this is going to be pretty subjective. How do you handle that when somebody looks at computer-wise and you have to?
Let me take that. Who is the mathematician, by the way?
Tyler Jarvis. He's a mathematician at BYU who's looked at Utah's districts.
So I'm going to echo what Dr. Fauci has been saying over and over again about coronavirus models. Models are only as good as the inputs you put into them and the assumptions you make when you're designing your models, right? So these mathematicians who put together these models, depending on the sophistication of their models, their criteria and their evaluation and their arguments about the math behind the models will be based on the criteria and the assumptions they put in. One of my frustrations with these models over the years and these mathematicians who come in and say math can solve redistricting is when you're starting to look at it, and I think about this in the legislative context, when a legislator is like, I want to do everything I can to make sure grandma's precinct is in my district, you can't model that mathematically, because mathematicians have no way to know which legislator's grandmother lives in her district and really wants her grandmother's house in her district. So there's a lot of sort of non-mathematical, sort of practical inputs that go into redistricting that are very hard to capture in these mathematical models. For example, as Jeff mentioned, the concept of communities of interest. There are lots of different ways to define those, but mathematically, I'm not quite sure how you do that. The math models are really good at saying, okay, we're going to draw the most compact districts that we possibly can and try to minimize, sort of bunking incumbent legislators with each other. Well, that's, two basic premises, and they can model that mathematically. It's when you start to consider other things that go into these models that I so far I really haven't found a mathematical model that covers all of the other things that involve local knowledge of the state, for example, that these mathematical models just don't have programmed into their assumptions. Jeff, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I would add to it. I was at a redistricting hearing years back where a state legislator who was not very happy with the draft plan showed up at a hearing and slammed down on the desk of each member of the committee a photograph of a church. And then he made the point in his testimony that you and you and you and you don't know what that is. Well, that's St. John's Church, and everybody in my district goes to that church. They know that church. That's us. And you've divided that church community, I'm almost sounding like him now, 5 or 6 ways. Shame on you. And that goes to the point of what Jason said, that these computers won't know that church, won't know the fabric of the community as to what holds it together. Now, the courts have long said, I'll say long said, redistricting was not something that we even engaged in prior to the 1960s. Just 60 years ago, after Baker v. Carr set the doors open for one person, one vote. But for the last 60 some odd years, the courts have usually said or held that a plan enacted by a state or locality is presumed to be legal unless the plaintiffs, the challengers, can come in and show legal fault with the plan. Now, the plan that I draw or the plan that you draw without computers might be totally legal. A computer algorithm might come in and rip it apart how many number of ways. But if the plan meets with constitutional and statutory muster, and it's a plan that the people enacted, not the computers enacted, but the people, then that plan should withstand judicial muster if you comported with federal one person, one vote, the Federal Voting Rights Act, and the state constitution. It might not be the best plan that everybody likes, but if the majority of the enactors vote for it, it is presumed to be legal. With the algorithm plans that come in, they call them actually ensemble plans, which will give you 5 or 6 different kinds of comparisons. Well, if a plan has a legal deficiency, then those mathematical models come in very usefully. That's what happened in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, where courts look to these models to knock down plans. But there's a presumption, and this is the important part, that what you do, if it follows objective legal criteria and standards, should be upheld whether you run mathematical models or not. That might be a little bit old-fashioned, but that's what our law is based on.
Yes.
Thank you. Sure, Commissioner Bishop.
Can I ask a couple of questions that are related? The first one is, we are an advisory group, whereas the legislature makes the final decisions.
Mhm.
When it comes to litigation, what do you think the odds are that this plan that we as an advisory group will be litigated as opposed to what the legislature will do? And secondly, kind of going with that, you said litigation that violates criteria. Is it then wiser to have fewer criteria to avoid litigation processes, or would you have more detailed criteria?
I think a bunch of your criteria is laid out in your law. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but it's not defined, but that's okay.
Right. It's not well defined. It's laid out. It's not defined. That's true. I think whether what you adopt gets through your legislature really depends on what kind of map you draw and how you build your map and build your process to defend the ultimate map that you recommend to the legislature. For example, I mean, in Iowa, for example, they have some computer generated models and the legislature has to basically accept them or reject them, that the legislature can't modify, and they can keep sending it back a bunch of times. And more often than not, the legislature accepts the computer model almost the first time by routine. So I do think it is possible for the commission to put together a plan that the legislature will adopt. And frankly, that may well include, and how you figure that out, that may well include comments you receive from legislators during the process, whether it's at hearings or in emails. But again, it probably should be through a public process. But you'll hear from legislators. You'll know where the legislators are on the plan as you roll out drafts, because the legislators, their political people, their official staff will come in and tell you kind of what they think. They're generally not shy about that.
Yeah, I think when I opened tonight, I began by saying that the task ahead of you is to develop the kind of a plan that the legislature should adopt through a fair, effective, transparent process. And if you can suggest ways or work with ways to best define compactness or contiguity, or show why the plan that you recommend is compact, is contiguous, does keep splits of jurisdictions to a minimum, does keep so-called communities of interest together, ideally, how could the legislature not adopt the plan? And if the legislature does reject your plan and puts in one of its own that might be more suspect, that might have weaker legal basis, and it's challenged in court, nothing stops a court from going back to your commission plan. That could happen. I have been involved in a situation where a township brought me in to, from soup to nuts, run their entire process. And we developed a town board map based on school districts and communities of interest, not on incumbency, that was allowed under the town charter. And it went swimmingly well. We got this plan through this commission. It was almost, I think it was unanimous. The newspapers, the press, the good government groups loved it. But 3 months later, just before Christmas, end of the year, the town charter also let the legislature do whatever it wants. And they substituted an incumbent protection plan of their own at the last minute, throwing out all the work of the commission. So except that I had to be the one to draw that final map that then the press never knew about. So you've got to just look at this thing from the timetable, the players, who's watching you. And it's going to be much more of an open watch process, as Jason said, this time than ever before. But be prepared for the unexpected, expect the unexpected, but try to do a better job than anyone else can do, and just keep your eye on that prize.
And one thing I will tell you, legislators, if there's anything that they really care deeply about, it is the shape of their district. And they won't be afraid to speak their mind at every opportunity that they have to speak their mind.
Yeah, the problem, well, the challenge you'll have with that is that the more you draw districts that might protect or consider incumbent districts and where their homes are, you're going to find the good government groups complaining, stop drawing lines for the politicians, let the people draw the lines to then pick who represents them later. So you have to, there'll be a balancing act. And when you talk about which criteria do you follow and how do you follow one from the other, well, the criteria are not ranked. But to the extent that you can give some weight that these districts are all compact, that they are all contiguous, that they did split as many or as few jurisdictions as possible, that it kept as many self-defined communities of interest intact as possible. If you can do all of those things or a majority of them, then you're a lot better off than just maybe a few minimal ones for each of the criteria. Ideally, you'd want to have ranked criteria, because if you meet criteria 1, 2, and 3, then maybe you can't do 4 and 5, but at least you can explain your way out of that.
Other questions? Karen or Commissioner Hale and then Commissioner Hilliard?
Thank you. Jeff, you had suggested that we take advantage of the time we have before the numbers come out to do some education and outreach.
I'm wondering if you could share with us some successes you've seen. Are there discussions about criteria? Are there discussions about how we use computer programs? Tell us what you've seen that has been successful.
It's still early in the process, even though it's late in the process. So not that many states have done that much yet, not knowing until recently when the census data would come out. But the Oklahoma legislature went out and did a roadshow of hearings all across the state. They also got their plan out using non-redistricting census data, use the American Community Survey data as a first draft set of plans. But it never hurts to undertake education, training, outreach, developing an outreach program, developing a staff that can reach out to civic associations, good government groups, minority groups, neighborhood associations, you name it, and let them know that you're in business, what you're doing, and why this, and first of all, explain why this is important. I often joke that for all the years I've worked in redistricting, my mother never quite knew what I did, but when the California Senate hired me 10 years ago, and I go visit her once a month in California, she said, whatever you're doing is great, but like, what is redistricting? And I think you need to let people understand, look outside your window, your roads, your schools, your hospitals, your senior centers, your childcare facilities. Everything is based on government programs, and those government programs are enacted by the people you elect to serve in Washington, Salt Lake City, and the local governments. That is redistricting. So if you care about the future of your community for the next 10 years, then you're going to care about who represents you in these governmental bodies. And you start with the very building blocks. Why is this important to me? Then you get into the the nitty gritty, the basics that you hold, hearings, that there's criteria, one person, one vote, Voting Rights Act. I probably give about three or four webinars a week now, just in New York alone through my law school, to explain the process to people. But they keep inviting me back, so I'm probably doing something right. But it's a challenge because once upon a time doing campaign work, I'd say, I do advance. Well, what the heck is advance? Well, you take the candidate around, you drive them, whatever that, but you have to explain these things to people. And with redistricting, I recently learned that redistricting, according to focus groups, has a negative connotation because the word re is something negative, that you're just doing over the same status quo. So think of it in terms of community empowerment, again balanced by incumbent considerations to get your plan through the legislature. It isn't all one big panacea. There is a political world out there. So you've got a balancing act and an interesting journey ahead of you.
I mean, just to address your question about the kinds of things you can do now, public education is one. Data processing and doing what you can to make data available is important as well. For example, I have seen a couple of states put together, based on estimates, and they sort of caution and footnote everything and say, look, based on the 2019 estimates, here are the districts that we think need to shrink or grow based on whether they're overpopulated or underpopulated. And they give the estimated population of the districts, and people can look at it, and legislators can start to look at it, and civic associations and good government groups and other advocates can look at the maps and say, okay, well, now I understand where the population growth was in the state and what areas of the state lost population compared to others. And you really can start to get a sense of what generally needs to happen, even though you won't have the specific data. And I think the more data commissions and legislators can make available early, the more people will understand what's going to happen when the sort of whirlwind of the post-August 16th data release becomes reality.
Yeah, and actually there is a website you can go to, and I'll spell this out for you, www.redistrictingandyou.org. That's redistrictingandyou.org. That website, developed by the City University of New York Mapping Service, shows for every congressional, state Senate, and state House district the population overage or underage based on the new state population total. So you take the size of the Utah Senate or the size of the Utah House divided into the state population, and you get your average, your mean population for each district. And you can then you type into the website, Utah Congressional #1, and then it will show you what the new ideal mean population is for each district in the state. And then based on the Census Bureau's 2019 projections against the state population, how much that each individual district is over or under where it needs to be if zero deviation, was what you were seeking. So it's very instructive to let people know that their district is either under or over X people or X percent, keeping in mind, of course, that the final census numbers that come out in August may be very different, but at least it's a training tool.
Right. There's also another website you can look at, davesredistricting.org. They've got the 2019 estimates. So, I just called it up while we were on the phone, and, there's a district that appears to be 15,000 people or so over the ideal population, in the state house. So that district obviously is going to need to lose about 15,000 people to come down closer to the ideal. And then you've got other districts that are down a few thousand people. So you can start to see on the map kind of which districts are underpopulated or overpopulated. Another district here is approximately 19,000 people over. So, you don't know specifically until we get the redistricting data, but you can start to see where the sort of ups and downs are and which districts are going to have to shrink and grow.
Yeah, Jason, I'll give you one. The Census Bureau is planning to compensate for or to protect the privacy of people's census responses through a program they call differential privacy. And I'll let Jason explain what it is, but earlier last year, the Utah legislature did a study of what differential privacy would mean to the Utah legislature. And by the report I recall reading, a whole town of 15,000 people disappeared because of the Census Bureau's effort to move people around to hide their identity at the redistricting block level situation. And it's the subject now of a major lawsuit that Jason has brought in Alabama. But the Utah legislature did take a very long look at what the possible impact of differential privacy might be in Utah, albeit that the study done a year ago was done on a different norm than what the Census Bureau is planning on doing now. So it wouldn't be as severe. But Jason, you want to say something about DP? Not too much.
Yeah, I could go on for hours about this what they call disclosure avoidance that the Census Bureau is doing. But bottom line is we're waiting on the court in Alabama to rule. We had our hearing May 3rd, and we're going to be heading, whoever wins or loses is probably heading straight to the Supreme Court because it's one of those 3-judge panels that bypasses the Intermediate Appeals Court. But basically what the Bureau is doing is kind of a new disclosure avoidance method. And the frustrating part to me and to Jeff and other people in the redistricting world is all of their past disclosure avoidance methods, which they have sort of historically applied, has always kept the block level populations constant. And this time they're not going to do that. So, for example, we've wound up with, census blocks in their latest demonstration data where there are more occupied housing units than there are population in the block. So if they tell you that there's 20 occupied houses in the block and they tell you there are 5 people that live there, they're giving out some implausible numbers. In the latest data release, the Alabama data would show about 2,000 census blocks with kids living there under 18 with no adults over 18 living in that census block, and just illogical things that will show up. So we're going to have to very carefully, if I don't win the lawsuit in Alabama or at the Supreme Court, everybody's going to have to look really carefully for anomalies in the census data and figure out how to deal with those. Exactly how we're going to deal with those, I don't know. The Bureau still, I kid you not, still tinkering with how they're going to do this disclosure avoidance. But I could spend an hour and a half or 2 hours easily just talking you through all of the.
Yeah,
minutiae of this.
in a very simple sentence or two, differential privacy or disclosure avoidance is the Census Bureau's methodology for protecting the identities of people in the census. If you have a census block of 100 people, what they might do so that no hacker can figure out who those 100 people are is take 10 people out and put 3 people in. They call it adding noise to the census. And it's all based on something called an epsilon that raises or lowers depending on how many people you take in or out of a census block. The concern we have as redistrictors is that for one person, one vote, and for Voting Rights Act compliance, if we don't know exactly how many people live in a district, then we have problems in drawing fair districts and legal districts later on.
And just to give you one quick example, and then we probably shouldn't belabor this one. In the latest version of differential privacy in Alabama, one of their state legislative districts that was heavily litigated over the last decade, if you look at the 2010 actual census data, is a majority minority district. And when you look at the data under the latest version of differential privacy, the district is no longer a majority minority district, even though we know in reality it is. So the Bureau is potentially creating all kinds of problems unless we win this lawsuit. But we'll deal with those problems if I lose the lawsuit.
Well, good luck, Commissioner Hilliard.
Well, I have a comment and a question. My first comment is I'd appreciate Gordon sending me links to those sites you said, because I really would like to see what the House, Senate is. The other question I have is this. Most of the people who talk to me, which is not a lot, are concerned that the Republicans control the legislature, and therefore they're going to gerrymandering everything for the Republicans. I'm sure if I were in a Democratic state and talked to a Republican, they'd say just the same. One of the things in our law that I think is interesting, it says we're not to consider political registration and voting. We're to go outside of that. And so the obvious question is political involvement a community of interest? Can I look at some place and say, this has more Republicans or more Democrats or more independents? And the second part of that is even though I may not do that, and I don't even want to hear it, I just want to say, let's look at population number, do community outside of that. I'm sure somebody is going to sit down after we've got their maps out and say, look what these people have done. They put all these Republicans in one area or all these Democrats or whatever. I'm sure they're going to second guess what we've done based on this information, which I think being a statute we shouldn't use. Could you respond to that?
Everybody thinks they can draw a better map than whoever drew the map. So that's, no matter what you draw, someone's going to criticize it. Obviously, your first obligation is to meet the legal requirements, but then you also have to deal with the practical side of you want to produce a map that can get adopted by the current legislature. And so that's one of the challenges here. Exactly what data you consider as you're drawing is going to become critical in any lawsuit that follows here. Did you consider 2020 election returns, 2018 election returns? Did you look at special election returns? Did you look at voter registration in your state? Did you look at voter turnout when you were doing this? All of the data pieces that you look at as you're drawing these districts is going to become, it will be public. And obviously, if there's any litigation, will become an issue in the litigation. And that's why you need counsel from the beginning to help walk you through what you should or shouldn't look at as you're going through this process.
Yeah, communities of interest, as I mentioned, is relatively a new phenomenon in redistricting. And I've never seen in all the situations I've been through using Republicans and Democrats as communities of interest. Now, having said that, you might find people tend to live where they find people that they want to live with. And that often might mean people will move to Republican or Democratic communities. Then you're dealing with more jurisdictionally recognized communities than political communities. That town A may vote Democratic and town B may vote Republican. You can draw a district based on town A or town B as communities of interest, which then happen to fall under one partisan bent or the other. But you can't always, I mean, this is a zero-sum game in that one party or the other will win the majority of seats. And to think you can take politics completely out of redistricting is something that I'm not convinced of yet. And Jason and I may disagree on who we want to see as Speaker of the House of Representatives, but you don't also want to be egregious, greedy, do more than what's reasonable. A lot of the criticism of redistricting took place in states from both parties. I'll mention Maryland and New York, and Jason brought the lawsuit there. There was the Republican side. You had North Carolina, you had Wisconsin, where all these partisan gerrymandering challenges reached the Supreme Court by 2 years ago. And for 30, 40 years, the Supreme Court kept saying, well, since the 1980s, well, partisan gerrymandering is something that's justiciable. The courts, could hear these cases, but we haven't seen it yet. And after the 1980s, the 1990s, by the 2000s, former Justice Anthony Kennedy said, well, this Pennsylvania challenge isn't a partisan gerrymander, but in thinking about it, maybe a challenge not based on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, but maybe a challenge based on the First Amendment, freedom of association, freedom of speech might work. And for 20 years, every lawsuit was brought trying to find some way to get before a favorable Anthony Kennedy-based Supreme Court. And it all culminated by the late 2010s out of Wisconsin first, where a law professor and a mathematician invented something called the efficiency gap. And everybody thought the efficiency gap would finally solve partisan gerrymandering by measuring votes and seats. And if in Wisconsin, if the Democrats got 60% of the statewide vote and 40% of the seats, and the Republicans got 40% of the vote and 60% of the seats, well, something's wrong. And the Wisconsin Federal District Court said, yes, something was wrong, and they invalidated the plan. Then it goes to the Supreme Court. And in one of the cases, Chief Justice Roberts said that these are all sociological gobbledygook, these formulas. And I don't think he's changed his opinion since then. He's about to get a plethora more of challenges in the next 2-3 years on this. But there's a whole world out there on partisan gerrymandering that now will be more an issue of state courts to hear. And if you have a challenge in Utah based on partisan issues, it's going to go to state court. And that's going to be based on whether there's a part of the Utah Constitution or statutes that allows for freedom of association, freedom of speech, assembly, freedom to vote. People find all sorts of ways in constitutions to bring a lawsuit and see if they have standing and a leg to stand on. Argue on.
That said, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the congressional map in 2018. I was counsel for the state Senate in that case. For 40 years, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had said our state constitution doesn't speak to partisan gerrymandering. And so these partisan gerrymandering claims can't be brought in federal court until the majority on the court changed from a more conservative court to a more liberal court. And actually in Pennsylvania, they elect judges with partisan labels. So it went from a 5-2 Republican court to a 5-2 Democrat court in the last decade. And right after the Democrats took over the majority on the court, Democrats sued and basically got the court to change 40 years of interpretation of the state constitution to find a partisan gerrymandering claim in the state constitution that for 40 years, the state Supreme Court had said wasn't there. So to give you a sense, there's a lot of give and take on this and a lot of changes and a lot of interpretation and a lot of legal arguments that go into all of these cases.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing I suggest is not to really worry yet about what the legislature might do since you haven't started your job yet. You'll find during this path that if you're going in the direction you think the legislature isn't going to like, you're going to know it. if they don't tell you, you'll still know it by seeing the data, the numbers, and the map?
Thank you very much. Any other questions from members of the commission?
Thank you.
Yeah, we really
Thank you very
appreciate you taking your time, especially in the evening hours, as it is back on the East Coast. And with that, let's take a short break.
right.
And then come back.
Thank you.
And
Okay,
we'll
thank you
have-
very much.
We'll hear from.
Bye-bye.
Dr.
Thank you,
Mack.
gentlemen. Thank
Bye.
you.
So thank you.
Very informational.
So we'll go ahead and resume. We appreciate Dr. Magleby being patient and waiting for us as we took a little break. Dr. Magleby is on the faculty at the State University of New York at Binghamton. And he's done a variety of things around redistricting over the last several years. I'll let him tell us a little bit more about that, but I do appreciate that he got the dress code. I'd like to say, I wish I could take credit that it comes from me, but it actually, it's deeply inherited in his genes. His father, Dean Magleby, David Magleby.
He's David.
Yes, he's
Okay.
David's son,
Wonderful.
for those of you
Just say
who
that name is so
David
familiar.
Magleby. So, Dan, we'll go ahead and give the floor to you.
I don't know if you can hear you.
Nope, I'm not sure. Dan, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Nope.
Your
Okay.
video is not, the owl is not showing on the Zoom, however, it is showing on the YouTube link.
Oh, interesting.
Half working today. More technical difficulties.
Well, let me mute if that works.
He's still muted.
Dan, can you hear me now? Nope. Let's see. Let's unplug this. Replug it in. All right, Dan, can you hear me now?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. Testing. Okay, could you hear that, Dan?
Nope.
Sign language.
What?
I sent him a request to unmute, so if he gets that.
So if Dan can hear, what I worry is that our YouTube folks can't hear.
Would it help if he takes off his hat?
It might. He missed all of the laudatory things I said about him.
Trying to signal him to start.
Yes, Moira, will you send him a message that tells him to go ahead and start that we can?
I don't, can you see us though?
This is in the panelist setting. I can see if there's,
Oh,
my abilities are a little bit.
Can't hear him either.
Yeah.
well, I'm not sure. I don't see the chat either. Boy, Dan, this is interesting.
Make him wait and then don't give him a stage.
Not good.
But it's a darn good presentation.
Well, we turned it off and turned it back on. Put it back. Let's unplug it again. That's correct. But it seems to me that it's a problem. And not,
This other camera is all of a sudden starting to rotate. I don't know if that's.
I think it's because it's turning on.
Okay.
If you want, I can unmute myself and start my video and ask him to present this presentation.
Okay.
Hi, Dan. We're having some technical difficulties really briefly. If you could just start presenting, that would be great.
Oh, you could call him real quick and talk to him.
I have an email. I don't have a phone number for Dan.
Or we can hold up a sign. If you
Yeah.
can see us and
Oh,
just say.
that's a good idea. Let's hold up a sign.
I have done that.
It works.
Talk.
Why doesn't somebody do a sign?
Um,
Can you hear me now? Hello?
We can hear you.
I'm not sure what's going on exactly. I am having, I guess the technical difficulty must be on my end. I can only see the black screen before.
It was possible to see the commissioners. I'm sorry that I must have
Now we can hear you.
done
No, we-
something on my end.
We can hear you now, Dan. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah, I'm sorry. They're the commissioners. Hello.
Well, you missed my lauding your bow tie and ratting you out as Dave Maggleby's son.
Oh dear.
So I apologize that you didn't get to hear that, but if you'll go ahead and just tell us a little bit about your background and why it is that you're interested in redistricting, and then go ahead and dive right into your presentation.
Sure. So my name is Daniel Magleby. I'm a professor of political science and economics at SUNY Binghamton in upstate New York. I am a stranger in a strange land in New York, however, because I wasn't born in Utah, unfortunately, but I was raised in Provo. I'm an alumnus of BYU. I try really hard to wear bow ties anytime I'm around Professor Facer. I am interested in redistricting. I'm interested in redistricting for lots of reasons. I came to this as a political scientist, interested in a lot of the tools that your previous panelists were suggesting had problems. So I do work on algorithmic redistricting, thinking about metrics for measuring partisan gerrymandering and other types of gerrymandering. I also do work analyzing voting rights in jurisdictions covered by the Voting Rights Act. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry that technical difficulties have, oh, now there's even more technical difficulties. There we go. That's the one we want. So I'm delighted to be here. And Professor Facer, Chairman Facer, asked me to share with you some findings related to research that I've done on the effects of redistricting commissions. I think the idea of a redistricting commission is not new. They've been around in several jurisdictions now for several cycles. And we know something about how they operate. And so my hope tonight is to talk to you about how effectively redistricting commissions have avoided partisan gerrymanders. I'm going to spoil my talk right now, my presentation right now, and tell you that their results have been mixed. Some commissions have done a good job of avoiding the pitfalls of of partisan gerrymandering. Others have been less effective. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why I think that might be the case. To give you an overview of where I'm going to go over the next couple of minutes, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define gerrymanderings. And I'm making that plural very deliberately because it turns out there are multiple ways that you can gerrymander a jurisdiction. And I'm going to end up by answering a question about whether gerrymanders can be solved by handing the redistricting process over to a group of independent commissioners like you. In order to get there, though, I'm going to have to take a digression into simulation methods, these algorithms that your previous panelists had talked about briefly. I'm going to try and keep this. I'm going to try and exercise some restraint and not go into the very technical details of this, but I'm happy to talk about the technical details of how these work if you have questions about it. So with that in mind, that's where we're going. Let me turn first to this idea of defining what a gerrymander is. I think we talk about these quite often, but it's useful to take a minute and think about exactly what a gerrymander is and how it operates and how it works. So when I talk about this with students, I show them a grid that looks like this. And I say, imagine that you're a commissioner. And this is the first time that I get to say, you are a commissioner. So imagine you're a commissioner in charge of a jurisdiction like this, a simple one, small, 25 residents. You're tasked with dividing this jurisdiction into 5 districts with equal population. Imagine also that this jurisdiction has groups of people, call them communities of interest, call them members of a political party, members of particular racial or ethnic groups that live in communities, one concentrated towards the north of this map and another concentrated towards the south of this map. Now, I've drawn this very deliberately so that the red group, whoever that may be, makes up 40% of the population, and the blue group makes up 60% of the population. Now, as a commissioner, you start off by thinking about what it is that you would like to accomplish. And just for a moment, I know this is not the case with anyone on this call, but for a moment, you wanted to ensure that the blue group maximized its representation, that it received as many seats in the legislature or as many representatives in the delegation as you could possibly muster. There was a really easy way of doing that. We call this a cracking gerrymander, and that would be to draw districts that look something like this. Observe that each of these districts has the same proportion of red residents as it has blue residents. They've been divided evenly across all districts, but the result would be that the blues would elect a representative from among their number in each of these districts, and the reds, even though they make up a substantial proportion of this jurisdiction, 40%, get 0 representation. So when we think about this cracking gerrymander, the result of it is exclusion from representation. And so when we think about what we might want to accomplish in a districting process, it may be to avoid exclusion. It may be to accomplish exclusion as well, though there's lots of reasons to wonder or worry about a system that denies a substantial proportion of its population representation in legislative bodies. Now, if we go back to this grid and say you have a different set of goals, that maybe you would like to maximize red representation, and in doing that, you would have to get a little more creative with how you draw the lines, but you could do it by engaging in what we call a packing gerrymander. Here it is a packing gerrymander because we've concentrated blue residents into a couple of districts, a minority of districts, and then we've distributed red residents across the remaining districts. The result of this style of gerrymander is that reds, even though they make up a minority of the population, actually get a majority of the representation. They get 3 out of the 5 seats, whereas blues, even though they're 60% of the population, they only get 2 of the seats. And we worry about these kinds of gerrymanders because the result might be something that we call entrenchment. That is, that as legislators continue to draw districts for themselves over and over and over again, they have very little incentive to draw a map that is treating the red residents of this the blue residents of this jurisdiction fairly. So even though they make up a majority of the population, they'll continue to have a minority of the representation moving forward. Okay, so these are the 2 types of gerrymanders that I want to talk about, a packing gerrymander and a cracking gerrymander, and they accomplish different things. One accomplishes exclusion, one accomplishes this, or potentially could lead to entrenchment of a minority in a majority of seats. So one of the things we do, and I can answer questions about how technical this gets if you would like, but one of the things that we observe in scenarios where jurisdictions have been cracked is that districts become more similar. So on average, they have the same composition of voters, the same distribution of different types of communities, the same distribution of partisan voters. So when we're measuring, say, the average composition of these districts, they become very similar. And one way we think about that in terms of statistics is we use what's called a standard deviation, that they're just much more similar. In a picture, it might look like this. So imagine that this is a distribution, this gray line, I actually have a way of pointing to this, it should work. This gray line here is the distribution of an unbiased set of districts that were not drawn with any particular goal of advantaging or disadvantaging one group. It would be, this is an arbitrary line, but imagine it's here. And when we crack the same jurisdiction, what we'll end up getting is that the districts all end up being in this tighter distribution. They're much more similar than we would otherwise expect. On the other hand, when we engage in a packing gerrymander, it introduces what we call skew into the distribution. And the skew is important because it's going to result in an outcome where we deny a majority of representation to a majority of the population under particular circumstances. And here, the distribution of voters across districts might look something more like this. So observe, the majority of seats are here, and we've got a few of the seats over in this direction, but this sort of bimodal distribution that's heavily skewed in one direction differs significantly, again, from what we think of as this fair distribution of voters across districts. So when we're thinking about finding instances where gerrymandering has occurred, we're looking for the ways that voters are distributed across districts and whether or not they've been distributed in ways that follow these patterns, either where the standard deviation, they become more similar than they otherwise ought to be, or they're more skewed than they otherwise might to be. So one type of voter is more concentrated in a minority of districts than they otherwise ought to be. All right, so this brings us to a simulation because I keep saying we've got to think about how they otherwise ought to be. And as I was thinking about how to talk about this with you tonight, I was reading the news this morning and I saw this headline. It said that the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine was 100% effective in adolescents, the company says. So what does COVID have to do with redistricting? Well, the way that we think about whether or not vaccines are safe and effective is the same way we're going to think about how we evaluate districts using these algorithmic techniques that the previous panelists have talked about. So how does this work when we're thinking about a vaccine? Well, when we're figuring out whether a vaccine has been effective, we have a group that is sorted into a treatment group randomly and another one that is sorted into a control group randomly. And what we hope is that if you receive the vaccine, that there are 0 cases of people who are infected, right? That's what happened for both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine a couple of weeks ago, that people who received, adolescents who received the vaccine did not get infected with COVID-19. But that doesn't tell the whole story because we need to know what happens in the control group as well. Because if it turns out that nobody in the control group got COVID either, then this is all for nothing, right? So the reason why we know the treatment is effective is because we observe this control, a group of people who didn't receive the vaccine, and there were more than 0 cases of COVID in that group. So now we can claim that because of the vaccine, this group of people have avoided getting infected with COVID-19. So I want to think about, or I'd like you to think about with me, the way that we could think about measuring the effects of gerrymanders. And we're going to do this the same way that folks at Moderna and folks at Pfizer and folks at all the other vaccine companies did it as well. So we're going to think about a treatment and a control group. But in this instance, in what I'm going to show you, we're going to think about the treatment as being a legislature commission drawn map. So this is a group that may have engaged in mischief as they drew maps in order to advantage or disadvantage a particular group. And if they in fact engaged in mischief, then what we should observe is a type of bias, either that bias towards compressed standard deviations, less variance than we otherwise would expect, or this introduction of skew into the distribution of voters across districts, this over-concentration, more concentration of voters than we otherwise might expect. But there's a problem because we don't ever actually, unlike vaccine trials, political scientists don't get to introduce randomness and say, you get to live in a jurisdiction that does this, and you get to live in a jurisdiction that does that. And the question then is, what does it look like if we were to observe a control? And this is why we use these computer algorithms, because we don't actually get to observe elections under alternative maps. We're stuck with the maps that you and the legislature draw. So this can be a problem because it turns out that geography is complicated. I showed you this very simple grid a few moments ago. But it turns out the geography is much more complicated than that. So I want to show you a grid we use to simulate what it looks like, what redistricting, something closer to what redistricting looks like in the real world. So here, there are red dots, there are blue dots, there are green dots for people who don't belong to the red or blue group, It turns out that the red group is distributed fairly evenly across the space, but the blue dots have concentrated themselves towards the middle. And the question then is, if we were to engage in a process that did not consider whether someone was a blue dot or a red dot, what would we get? And what we find is that typically when we have a system like this, when blue dots tend to be concentrated in areas closer to one another, that these districting simulations software and algorithms we use will draw districts that naturally over-concentrate blues in a particular district. There's a natural level of skew in the distribution we observe. Some people have called this a natural gerrymander. And the question is, when we're thinking about how we measure bias, then it shouldn't be about the total absence of bias. Perhaps we should be thinking about bias relative to what we would observe if we were drawing maps in a totally fair and neutral way. And that's exactly what these algorithms do. Now, for a moment, and I beg your pardon if you would like me to go into great detail about how the math works for these algorithms. I have slides ready for that. If someone has a question, I'm ready to talk about it. But the whole purpose of using these algorithms is to understand what a totally unbiased alternative redistricting scenario would look like. So this is the control against which we're going to compare what it is that well-intentioned or perhaps mischievous map makers do in order to understand just how much bias they're actually introducing into this process of drawing maps. All right, so this comes back to the question that Professor Facer asked me to come here and talk about, which is how did commissions do? And I'm going to focus on the last cycle of redistricting. I'm going to be watching with interest to see how you guys do. I'm going to watch with interest to see how the new commissions spread across the country do following the release of the census data later this summer. But I can tell you something about what happened following the 2010 cycle of redistricting. To do that, I'm going to show you some distributions. So first I want to introduce you to this x-axis, and we're going to think about how they did in terms of avoiding packing gerrymanders. So here on the x-axis, I'm going to plot where we expect states to be given how these redistricting simulations turned out. So here they could be biased either in favor of Democrats or against Democrats. A negative number is against Democrats, a positive number is against Republicans. So on the y-axis, I'm going to plot where the states actually ended up with the maps that were drawn either by their commissions or by their state legislators. And that means that if they've avoided introducing bias through the redistricting process, they should end up someplace on this 45-degree angle, right? So that means that where we expect them to be based on the simulations is exactly where they ended up. That doesn't mean that it's free of bias altogether. It means that they didn't introduce additional bias or remove more bias than we actually observe in the natural distribution of people in the state. So here's what it looks like in terms of packing gerrymanders. So you can see that there is this natural relationship that sort of the natural gerrymander that is present leads to, on average, a map that favors or disfavors one party. But a lot of places did quite a bit worse than we would expect based on the simulations, and some places did better. So I said I was going to talk about how commissions did. These were the commissions that were in place in 2010. And as you can see, on average, those states that are circled are a little bit closer to that 45-degree line than the states that are further away. And so we would say, in terms of avoiding packing gerrymanders, these gerrymanders that introduce skew and might violate majority rule by giving an advantage to one group and entrenching them in a majority. These states were well served by their commissions. They did a little bit better than the other states. Although you can see New York and Washington fall right on the line. They sort of performed exactly as we would expect. But even those states that had commissions still didn't avoid bias altogether. Now, you're probably looking, you might be squinting, it's small on your screens, but that's where Utah ended up. And so it's interesting that the observed median mean difference in Utah, so the way that we measure skew is by comparing the mean of the distribution of districts to the median. And Utah, we would expect Utah to be between 2 points against Democrats or 4 points against Democrats. And they ended up at 0 in the last round. But before, so I'm happy to talk about why that's the case. And it's going to be clear when I show you this next distribution about how states performed in terms of avoiding cracking gerrymanders. So here, instead of thinking about the introduction of this overconcentration, we're going to think about whether or not states were more compressed or less compressed in terms of their distribution of voters across districts. So again, on the x-axis, these are the results of these simulations. So this is our expectation of where we think they ought to be. And on the y-axis, we're going to plot where they ended up in their actual maps. And just as before, this red line, this 45-degree angle is going to be where we would expect them to be if they didn't introduce any additional bias based on the geographic distribution of voters in their states. Oh, hold on, there we go. So here we see how they ended up, and you can see again, there's quite a bit of variance in how states performed. Some states fell exactly where we would expect them to be, Illinois, California, and Washington again. And I'm going to circle the commissions, and again, they do more or less a little bit better. What's interesting for folks in Utah is that Utah falls here far below the line. So we would expect a standard deviation of about 12. That means there's a difference, a standard deviation of 12% across districts. And what we ended up getting in Utah was something between 4 and 6, a little bit more than 5. So districts in Utah were far more similar than we would have expected had the maps been drawn according to a neutral algorithmic process. That means that populations of voters, Democratic voters in Utah, had been divided more evenly across districts than we would expect from a truly neutral process. All right, so I was told to keep this short, and I probably have already gone too long, but I am grateful for being here, and I'm happy, as I said, to double back and explain anything further, but I would be interested in your questions if you have any. Looks like people are frozen. Hello? I'm seeing, okay. Hi, let's see.
Oh, I've got it. Yeah, wrong button. Okay, what I'm hoping is that you can now hear us, Dan.
I can hear you now, yes.
I can hear, you can hear us, but I can't hear you because it's on quiet.
Try
So-
again.
Hello.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, perfect.
And I just have to change that over to the owl for the speaker. Okay, I think we should be up and running. So nothing like a little bit of technology glitch to keep things interesting on our side of the table as well.
We might forget that we were doing this remotely if we.
Exactly. So the question that I had was that for those commissions that were closer to the lines, that were essentially less biased in the process, was there something that differentiated them from the other commissions?
So let me bring that back up and let's look at what those states had. Can you see, am I still on the screen?
No, but
but we can hear you, so.
we'll get that
So,
here
so
in
there,
a moment.
so there is variance here. These are I'm just circling the commissions that were I'm circling any instance where the map was not drawn by the state legislature, or where there was a commission that made a proposal to the state legislature. So as a political scientist, I'm always concerned about the political dynamics that may follow the proposal of a map, even when it's in an advisory capacity, like the commission in Utah, where the legislature can come along and change things. So I mean, New York, where I live, ended up doing pretty well here, even though New York has this sort of natural underlying bias against Democrats, because so many Democrats live next door to one another in New York City, and then Republicans are more efficiently distributed across the state in outlying communities outside of New York City and across upstate New York. And so, but the thing is the New York legislature understood that they didn't need it. New York's legislature can revise the map proposed by the commission as well. And they saw no need to, because there was such a large majority already in favor of Democrats in New York. Other places, you know, this is one of the challenging things here is there are only a handful of these commissions in place in 2010. So we don't have lots of degrees of freedom in terms of trying to understand exactly how these dynamics would work out. But the level of independence certainly seems to be a factor. And the level of political influence after the commission makes a proposal in places where the commission is in an advisory or a role where they're making a proposal that can then be revised by the legislature.
Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Hilliard.
My question is, in those states that had the independent commissions and they decided the final boundaries, how many of those commissions got involved in litigation? I can understand New York or Utah, we only make recommendations, but I think Arizona does it, California. How many of those states, the independent commission, after they finished their report, filed it, generated litigation that they had done it wrong?
So I don't know. I'm not aware of any instance where the commissions, well, I'll take that back. Virginia saw litigation. That was because Virginia revised the map after the fact. But the truly independent commissions, I'm not aware of any litigation in those states that at least made it to court. So Virginia's map was deemed a racial gerrymander and was eventually revised in order to remedy that situation.
Yeah, I think there was some litigation in Arizona, but I'm not familiar with the details of that.
I just can share, I was at an NCSL conference a number of years ago, and they gave us the history that the Democratic Party in Arizona filed an initiative and got the thing passed. And as soon as the commission came back with its first recommendation, the Democratic Party in Arizona sued it. And the kind of thing they thought were going to win. So I didn't have the results of it. It was just part of a discussion at NCSL when we talked about state legislature.
And that may be one question for the conference that we have here in about a month or so, that when we get some more legal experts together. So thank you. Other questions? Is the owl still working?
The owl is turned off, however, you're currently using my laptop screen so they can see.
Oh, that's even scarier.
Your ties loose.
Okay. I was going to say it's big and scary. So apologize to all the folks watching at home. All right. So any other questions? If not, again, thank you, Dan. We appreciate you taking the time to share your research with us and to remind us of these challenges that we have to keep in mind with cracking and packing kinds of issues. So we'll let you get on with the rest of your evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for waiting around. We know you.
Of course.
So thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next issue on our agenda, which is a discussion about communication strategy. Let me pull up some slides. I think I can pull them up. We'll Hey, there we go. So in hearing some of your kind of input last time, together with our staff, we've been trying to think about some of the innovative ways that we might have some communication. And Gordon, can I get you to give us kind of an update on some of that thinking?
Yeah, so right now we're putting together the RFP for communication marketing group. And a big part of the commission's responsibility is to reach to the public. So I've been involved in community cities where we would have these great public hearings where board would sit up on a dais and people would come up and talk to them. And nobody showed up. We didn't get as good input as you think, but we did that for years. UDOT started doing what they called open houses. They put these panels around. The people would go from station to station, then meet with the end and give a public comment. And through the process, they were educated. And so I was thinking maybe a combination of those kinds of things where maybe we could look at, you have these town days where we could go with our interns with computers and show people how you would enter the city even before the data comes. And then the commission could come later and be a part of a question answer, or doing these kinds of things where we would go down to St. George, where they have a little lazy river downtown, and start at 10 o'clock in the morning, set up computers and panel, and have a little flash mob with interns that would start bringing out the education to people. So the concern is if they come, they're going to start wanting to create districts, but you need to bring them through a process of why the district has to be done and what are the controls, what do they have to think about. And so sometimes the setting that you are taught these things is a big player in how well you know these things. So we go down to the farmers market here in Salt Lake, or we go down to Provo, we're in the downtown area. We start trying to get people energized, and we do this with a social media blitz. We send a bunch of content to radio, TV, to newspapers, so people are seeing these things. So in the RFP, we're looking at somebody that'll help us drive traffic to the website and to have events that are going to precede your actual hearing to each of these communities, so that this is already coming about, that they're being educated not only on the districting, but how to do the software. What does the web page look like? And so that's kind of the vision that we have, but it's really your outreach. So we want to make sure we're not going in a different direction than you want to see, and we want to get input from you as we're looking at this. And I wanted to just also say that the commissioners that did do the legal, we're going to be doing the RFP for the marketing. So you guys get to have the same fun as the
You get to go look for those.
So
Yeah.
don't make fun of them. It's tough. It is a little more rigorous than you would anticipate, but we want to do something that energizes this, that makes it the people's district. And so it's really a way to capture a lot of people's inputs.
Yeah.
So we'll talk.
I think it's part of that education process, the things that Lyle did with the websites about Utah population. It would be a good thing to share in those locales, that our district here has grown 15,000 more than
Right.
we can expect it, that something is going to have to happen.
It has to split or it has to shrink.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was struck by Jeff Wise's comments that we should take advantage of these early times to get a robust education program out there. And I was a little concerned that our travel schedule is back-ended after the data comes in. But the kind of plan you described might be ideal, where we really do an information blitz that doesn't require quite so much individual commissioner participation, so that people are primed for when we show up to give us good feedback, if we can balance that.
Yes, I think too, you know, with the public awareness campaign, as you look at, you know, different media events, and you've listed news outlets, radio, social media, I think too, community organizations can really be important to us and important to different communities throughout the state. And as we look at language access, as we look at ways to get good information to different communities, those community organizations are really going to be advantageous to us as we try to spread information. And then along with Jeff Weiss's comments, I really loved his idea of just simply asking, why is redistricting important to me? Why should people even care? And I think as we think about what we can be doing in the time we have before we receive those numbers, we can be working with different community organizations to get that discussion going and get the interest going into why different communities should be engaged.
The chair gave me, feed me a lot of information on emails. And one of the things that we talked about was maybe we do a blog or we do some kind of, where they have people sit down and they
Like
do a discussion of
the focus group.
Focus group, but a one-on-one with one-on-one.
Yeah.
And be able to have both video content and all these things would help get this information out to everybody.
Yeah, that sounds great.
What is the estimated timeframe to getting a team on board?
So the state is very thorough in the way it does procurement. So you're not going to break any rules.
I'd rather break the rules.
It's a lot faster.
No, we're not breaking any rules. We're going to be very conscientious, and we have written up the RFP. I've given it to the purchasing group. They're looking through it. They actually have a list of pre-approved marketing communication groups, because when they do their fire protection or they do these health outreaches, they already have groups. So we should be able to go a little bit quicker. I'm hoping that we don't need a long time. We're going to target just the ones that are pre-approved by the state, and that's the group we're going to go. And then, so to your question, I believe we could have it ready to go Tuesday of next week. I'm hoping just for a 2-week opportunity. One of the questions are, if you have $50,000, what would you do to get out to the whole public? We want to see how creative and what innovation, what kind of people we're dealing with. So we bring them back. We know they're going to help us with these ideas. And then, then about 4 or 5 days with the commissioner reviewing it, and then we'll adopt it and get moving. So
maybe a month. Okay.
Yeah, but I'm going to try to. That makes me sad when I say that.
My thought is that we're less than 3 months out from game day, as I call it, August 16th, and we can't worry about stuff like this after that. We got to be 100% into actually making maps, and
right,
so forth.
So
that's my concern.
Yeah, I'll talk to Rex. There's got to be some ways we can jumpstart this a little bit. When you do professional services, there's clauses in the state that you can do certain things. I don't know if I'm familiar with municipalities and what we can do. So I just have to see there's certain caps and limits of ways you can do some things and may have to do some of those things.
There may be media or nonprofit groups that would simply do it as part of service to their community without the necessity of being paid. And you may want to get them started real early while you're looking at the other thing.
No, I think you're right. I think talking to these communities, and I think even some religious groups, and seeing if they would encourage their people to get involved in these kind of things, that we could help get the word out and push this out. So we've talked about a lot of ideas of reaching as deep as we can into the community. It's good to have a good started message, because if you get out there and start talking to people without the material of the one-on-one, sometimes we get lost. And unfortunately, and unfortunately, they hired an engineer. So I really like the curves, the numbers he was showing. This marketing thing, I'm not that good at. So we do need to get that person involved because those charts and numbers will do nothing for the public. We need to be able to say this in a different fashion. But I loved it, so I'm not discouraging. I thought I'm going to go back and look at some of that.
Thank you. Other comments, please.
I guess the challenge really is, as my experience has been, until people are really impacted themselves, they really care of us. I mean, they'll hear it and but I mean, that's why I think it's important if we're, say, in St. George, they see their districts are too large, there's going to have to be some manipulation changes, because I don't think people in St. George or the House or Senate are going to really care about Logan. I mean, they're going to
So
want to
you've
know
got to
about
tailor it.
What's the backyard?
Second experience I found is that there are groups who will come to every meeting because they want to be able to say, now you heard from 40 of us here tonight. We 40, you're not listening to us because you didn't put us in this district, and for a house seat's probably going to be 50,000 people. And so they're going to have that kind of, I wish there was some way we could not at every town hall meeting hear the same lobbyist stand up and say the same thing for one area. But I'm sure that's going to happen.
Hard.
What we hope to do, we're also putting together a plan on how to make this information assimilable. You can assimilate it as a commission. So we're already starting to get emails and texts, and what we want to do, we're going to put together a sheet. We're going to do a summary of the information we get, and behind it, each one. So you can read each one individually, but then have a summary. And what the idea is, we'll give these to you bi-weekly so that you're not getting hit every day by 4 or 5 emails and trying to keep track of what everybody's telling you. So when the maps come in, we'll do the same thing, because if we get a lot of maps, we want to give you a summary of what they say, but you can still have access to see them all. So it's not and if there's an outlier that we don't have a category for, we'll say this one said something really interesting and this is what they said. And I don't know what it's going to say, but we'll live that. And so that way you can keep up, but at the same time go back and reflect on things you heard earlier because there's a summary. And we'll try to keep a going tally of what kind of comments were going. So maybe it's reasonable for you to have a life and do this. So not much of a life, but some of a life.
I only read one of the things you sent out, but it was one from California, unfortunately. But it made it very specific. Then this is what you were saying. There is quantitative information we're going to get and qualitative information we're going to get. And I know we're going to get the same crap coming over and over again. But if we can get some information that actually has some insight to it, that's what we want to find out. So someone has to go through it. I guess you're the one
to sift it.
Yeah, there'll be some friends of mine, but yes, I will go through each one of these, and we will have friends who will help disseminate it to you. And I think there's two things. There's two things I think going on here. You're not going to get great comments all the way through this, and some of them are going to be relevant to what your decisions are. But the idea too is the public, this is the public's map. So if they feel like they've been heard, even if their comments were not the same way, that's going to be a big difference. So the idea, there are 2 steps here. One is to really make sure the public gets an opportunity to get words to the commission, to really be part of the process. And then you can disseminate which of those things really influence the direction you go in your mapping. So that's, we'll be bringing that RFP back, and we'll be trying to get that done so that we're moving forward with that marketing campaign and giving materials out, content.
You might also want to contact whoever the vendor is for the census data, so they can start to put together packages about how to educate the public on how to use the online tools so that they can make their maps, because that's something that they could ask us. And other than Jeff, I wouldn't have any idea what to do.
You're in luck, because next on the 8th, the vendors for the 2 softwares, the one that the public's going to see and the one that the staff is going to use, are going to do presentations. So you're going to see, this group will be the first group in Utah that will learn how to do the mapping. And if I can learn to do it, then we know the whole state can do it. So we're going to be practicing over the next 2 weeks with 2010 data. And we're going to make some maps that don't make any sense, but we're going to work on it, and then we're going to come in and we're going to all learn some stuff together.
One of the people on the screen told us about something called ACS. That's the data that's not census data, but is sort of an informed guess.
Yeah, the American
Are we gonna
Community
be able to get
Survey.
access to that to play
We
with
could do that.
those kinds of
I was
tools.
just going to use the 2010 and just make you live that life over again, but we can get some. The problem is any data we get you, I don't want it to be too close to the truth because I want to, but we could get that. That's what we want to do. We could get something that's a little
I'm just thinking that might alert us again to the idea that in this district or
That's
this
good.
county, something is going to have to drastically change because the population has grown with new subdivisions, or that a new school opened or a new business opened. That would give us sort of a heads up.
that I was involved in creating the districts in Harriman in 2010. And by the time 2020 came around, there were districts that were twice the size of other districts because we made them so perfectly balanced in 2010 that the new areas lost all their capacity to vote because just the growth changed everything.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
You know, a question, as we talk about a communication strategy and as we talk about what's coming up on our next agenda, I'm just curious to know what kind of outreach we have now for encouraging people to tune in to these meetings now. Because I think these are very educational, helpful meetings that we're having right now. So what kind of outreach are we having with different organizations right now? I know that there are groups like Better Boundaries that are sending information out. Are we working with other organizations that are getting that info out as well?
We have not been very strategic about doing that yet. I think that's one of the places where, in all honesty, I've probably fallen a bit short. And you know, I think we can capitalize on that. I do know that the folks at Better Boundaries, the League of Women Voters, for example, have been trying to get that word out. But I think we can do better.
Can you get the guys that came in on the first meeting?
That was most entertaining.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it certainly got us in the newspaper. I think that's part of the issue as well as we have a better handle on our schedule. It'll be easier to make those meetings known in advance so that we can reach out to folks. So thank you. Other.
I'd like to make another suggestion. I think we ought to have you, Rex, and Gordon as our spokespeople. So if a newspaper person calls me or wants to comment, I'm going to refer them to you too. Because I think there's sometimes a game to get us against each other. And what you may say just innocently can be taken out of context in a way that makes it irritable.
I like that idea.
Sure.
That's what I'm going to do. If I get called, I'll say,
And happy to do that.
You may not be happy at the end, but thank you for volunteering.
Yeah. No, I feel like we've been de facto playing that role because it turns out that my email inbox is the one that they tend to find. So, and hopefully I haven't said anything embarrassing to anybody yet. So, and hopefully I won't, but.
And very soon you'll have access to counsel.
Yes.
Specialized on a speed dial.
Yes, and that'll be very helpful for all of us. So any other issues on the communications and marketing? We've lost your.
Oh, my bad.
No,
Yeah.
I was thinking that with the major employers in the area, including the state, but like Intermountain Healthcare and others, to put together some sort of a little summary blurb that they could then send out in their newsletters.
Sort of
saying,
public announcement.
Yeah.
Sort of public announcement that these meetings are happening and that hearings will be coming up. But that 1 out of 30 may pay attention to it, but it's one more person who knows to look for this if they're curious about it.
The radio stations and TV stations might help as well.
Are we doing any kind of press releases?
Oh,
We have not yet, but again, I think that's Gordon insinuated, I have been swamping him with information. And it is part of our plan to get some of that information going. We just haven't quite made it there yet. So just a quick, if I can figure out which computer I'm working on, a quick update on the logo and website. The designers are still working on it. And they've told us that they'll have the logo stuff I should have tomorrow is what they told me. And then the website is still making progress. We've got some of it is some of the content to put on the website that we've got now that we've got a little more staff support. We'll be able to start working on some of that as well. But not a lot to report on that front. Now, the more important issue in many ways is the future public hearings, locations, dates, etc. And one of the things that I guess I want to say about these is, other than June 8th, which we have scheduled as a regular commission meeting, and we've already started setting up some presentations like with the software folks and whatnot. The other meetings, June 29th, and then the July 19th through the 21st, we suggested that if we wanted to get out of town and get multiples done, that might be a window that we could use. And then in the August dates, the idea is that we can maybe do some extended outreach for those kinds of things. I'm wondering what kind of feedback that you all had on seeing the schedule, concerns, and again, I think the more we have the opportunity to hear from folks at these meetings, I think the more valuable we are, especially pre maps and data.
My only concern about that week is the 24th of July, that Friday, and sometimes that's the time that people take vacations and are gone. That's a unique to the Utah holiday.
What we were thinking is during that week, we have a lot of town days. It may not necessarily be commission meetings, but certainly welcome to go, but we could be going to their events. I know a lot of them have little groups and have little things that we ought to be, trying to get into the communities. They're seeing what we're doing. We explain why we're doing this and we teach them this stuff. So that might be the best time, not necessarily for you. If we also want to bring in one of our rock stars, that's great. But it'd be good to have have our interns there showing them the software, showing them how to do this. I want to discourage the population. Sometimes they see the software and they can't work it, so they just leave. But if they have somebody right there teaching them, it could be
I just got a text that somebody can't hear me, which is their blessing. Well, I think we just need to check with where we're going.
So again, some of these will be for the full commission. Others, I think we just are trying. So after August, those meetings are statutory meetings. We have to have those meetings. They have a more formal base to them. These we need to have a more. We need to engage the public to get excited about this, so that they know this is the public's, that the people's commission. They can really.
And even for the more formal hearings after August, there's still the option of being able to attend virtually.
Oh, yeah. So we'll be looking at, when you have these meetings in these various cities, we may rent out a school or city hall where you'll go, but we'll still set up so people can see it on the web or on Facebook.
Okay. But also,
Don't tell Jake we can hear him here.
So we could attend. I mean, if the commission has 10 hearings, if I get to 7 of them, I think I'm doing pretty well.
We'll be excited to have you all set. So we can have you up on the screen. Technology. Once we had COVID, we know we can do things now. We didn't know we could do this in the past, but now we can.
Well, I was just going to ask about conflicts. I only have one, but it's
How many people does it take to fix
I'm
that?
gonna say you don't need to hear me twice.
I think we're hearing you about 3 times.
It's worth repeating.
But yeah, if I can attend virtually, I can fit it in and still meet my other commitments.
Yeah.
We attempt that to happen.
No. We'll let you get the last word in there. Yeah. Okay. Other comments? If not, I wanted to look at a couple of things. The statute requires that we hold meetings in 7 different areas or regions around the state. Oh, you're on the YouTube. If you could show the Zoom. There we go. So it's 7 different areas around the state. So they've mapped out where those areas are. There we are. And the yellow, I guess those are triangles. Trying my geometry skills there for a moment. I apologize. Those are places in those areas where we're looking at potentially holding public meetings. Now, some of that was driven by the areas that the Legislative Redistricting Commission or Committee, who you may have noted, met last week, and they adopted a set of redistricting principles, which are fundamentally different from ours. But the other thing is around, they publish their schedule of meetings. And one of the suggestions that Gordon and I thought we would propose to you is part of the reason we gave you the dates that we did is that has us in those locations prior to the Legislative Redistricting Committee being there, so that we would have the chance to give our information on why redistricting matters and get their input. Plus, we're asking, in some ways, different kinds of questions that they would be asking. So thoughts, comments about whether or not these are the right places?
We have to at least have 7 meetings, and so we've scheduled for a few more than 7, but if you see a community that we bypassed by neglect, not by design, so we could certainly change or adjust those, and we don't want anybody feeling left out, so but again, there's a very small window to get these things done, so we're, in some of these, like, we're going to several here in Salt Lake Valley, and so we can figure out which ones we need to go to. We just want to make sure, and again, you can tell us over the next few weeks, not decide today, so just be thinking about the communities we may.
Commissioner Hilliard?
I don't really care whether we're before or after, because I think it'll be the interest created. It's not on the same day.
Yeah, yeah. And we're not on the same day. We're
about
a week or so apart.
And what we tried to do, the reason we're kind of adamant at that is like, what would be hard for, if we're the People's Districting Committee and they're going and getting information and we're not getting people to come, we're not getting that information because we're so separated in how we do that, that we'll lose a lot of public comment. So I think it's critical that we make sure we get all the public comment to the commission, that we're not somehow missing opportunities to talk.
I think you ought to explain that to Scott and to Representative Ray, Paul Ray.
Sure.
So they don't feel like we're trying to upstage them, so that they feel like now they have to change their times.
Sure. And I'll be happy to reach out to Representative Ray and Senator Sandel.
And do I understand correctly that on this schedule, the tentative meeting schedule contains slots that could potentially be used for public hearings in addition to the draft public meetings?
That's correct. That's correct.
'Cause it's, I mean, you've got 12 under the tentative.
Yes.
And if we think about needing to expand coverage at all, we can move them into those slots.
We could move them into the slots, and we can also use those earlier slots as that information gathering set of hearings that Commissioner Hale talked about, and as we heard from our earlier presenters.
I would see some of these hearings also be formal meetings, even in the back end, because we're bringing maps to you.
We're going to need it.
So you will be having formal meetings on the road.
So Commissioner Baker.
As part of the
when it it comes to the actual map drawing that we're gonna be doing, when are we gonna factor that in? It's gonna have to be done either between these meetings, or if we're gonna be public about it, we're gonna have to schedule a lot more meetings.
So I think that part of the idea is, Gordon just mentioned, is on some of these days where we have a public hearing, and maybe we have one scheduled in St. George, that we might hold a commission meeting prior to the public hearing to do some of the map drawing, and then hold the public hearing later in the afternoon or evening.
But that would still have to be open to the public.
But yes, that would still be open to the public.
So do we just do that on YouTube or something like that, let people watch?
Yep.
Have a,
Well, and I think that's one of the things for us to negotiate on our space access. We could do it in the same physical space that we're holding the later public hearing, because part of what we're making sure is that we've got access to technology, Wi-Fi, among other things, because we'll need that for uploading our maps to the cloud and those kinds of things. Commissioner Hilliard?
I'm just thinking of this process. I wonder in my mind, if we had a meeting before we got the information, and say we came to a community and said, here's the maps for your area from last year. Here's what we see the deviation. Now, you look at your maps and you tell us what you think your community of interest, where these lines ought to be. And my senatorial district, they're going to have to pick up 3,000 more people. Where do you think that ought to come from? Keeping in mind that that's going to impact District 17, where Peter Scott Sandal is, and even Rich County. Why don't you just kind of look at that and see how do you define community of interest? And what is compactness? How do you think? And let us say, well, we don't like this map because it did this. How would you correct it? It's simple to complain. The answer is you give a suggested change.
Yeah.
I very much like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that going along with that is when we ask them about communities of interest, ask them to tell us why that's a community of interest, not just to say, well, it's this little neighborhood over here, but what is it that is important about that neighborhood? Is it that they all work at the same place? Is it that they all play on the same softball league, or whatever it is, that we get them to articulate that. But if we don't ask them those questions, as you suggest, we won't get the answers.
I think they know they can come and talk to us about this and get out their frustration. That may get more people to attend.
Yeah, thank you. Other comments about
I was just thinking that when we have those public hearings, one of the suggestions, I think that was in one of the homework assignments you gave us.
Yeah, I apologize for being a professor there and sending you some deep reading. So
was that we have somebody who is skilled at being a facilitator run the meeting. That would take the burden off of you or Gordon, for example, so you could be thinking strategically rather than trying to be in the moment with that. So we may want to look to find somebody who has good facilitation skills to ask those questions like Lyle just did.
I think that's a great point. And as much as I enjoy facilitating groups, trying to do that while you're trying to think it and digest the information.
And keep track of what's being said.
Could that be our communications person?
Well, yeah, I think that very well could be part of the role of the communication.
She's no longer on the commission, but we used Pat Jones. She was super.
Yeah.
Because she could facilitate and she brought some respect to the meeting. It wasn't just some staff person that nobody ever heard of.
And you may want to have a couple people in different parts of the
Yeah.
parts of the state. She's down in St. George now, so maybe she could facilitate meetings down there, and maybe you guys can identify somebody from up north.
That would also be very good.
Because she could be there. I think Greg Bell, though, and I love Greg, he's a Republican senator. Pat's been a Democratic senator. You almost want to find somebody who has not been involved.
That high profile and a partisan. setting.
Sure.
I was just
Commissioner Hill.
going to say too, as we think about facilitators too, just having translation services there as
Yeah,
well would be important.
Although you could have a facilitator pair, one Republican and one Democrat, who can work together and just sort of take the
And that's
pressure off of
good.
each other.
That it should be easy to find someone with those skills. Yeah.
I think they'll be criticized.
It is exhausting though to do that. been
It is.
facilitator in
it's hard.
Nebraska as their
Yes, it's-
Supreme Court is going out to tribal communities.
Oh, it's
And at
hard
the end of the
work.
day, you're wrung out and there's no way that you could retain any substantive comment from that.
No, it's an excellent point and one that I very much appreciate because it would be very easy for me to fall back in the, oh, I do this all the time in the classroom, yet managing or orchestrating, but very much we want the commission to be absorbing this information and not having to be kind of directing traffic would be very helpful. So please.
Well, with the general comments we've made about the schedule, are we at a point where we want to approve this tentative draft as a draft schedule or? Oh,
On the agenda, you have it listed as a discussion item, so I recommend in the next meeting.
Okay.
Agendize it as an action item if you want to take a vote.
good point. Thank you.
And I think some of it may be if the facilities are available.
So
Oh, that's
you earned your
tricky,
pay
the
tonight. So.
logistics of it. Okay,
So.
thank you.
The other thing related to that I wanted to bring up is travel regulations. As you know, as a state body, we have to follow state travel regulations. Gordon's in the process of trying to understand those, and he'll get us some more guidance, likely at our meeting on the 8th. But one of the ones that I wanted to bring up is the redistricting conference in July. That's going to be here in Salt Lake. Now, there are some of you who may say, I live close enough that driving downtown and back home at night is not a big deal. Where Commissioner Hilliard, on the other hand, I'm pretty certain it doesn't want to drive the 2 hours to Logan and back.
And especially not during rush hours.
Exactly. And so, the commission is happy to have you stay overnight in the hotel, but we need to get that information to Gordon. We'll send an email out requesting that information. But again, when we have the same kind of thing on the public hearings, when we have a public hearing in Logan, it may well be that Commissioner Bishop says, I'm happy to drive home to Brigham City because I'd much rather sleep in my bed than in one of the fancy hotels they have in Logan. And so, again, there may be times where some of the commissioners end up staying overnight, but others don't, just because of the logistics of the travel. And we want to be amenable to keeping you safe, among other things. We don't want you driving down to Moab and driving back the same night, putting you in any kind of harm's way or anything. Okay.
Because then we have to get a replacement.
Well, exactly. And we'd have to re-educate them, please.
I'm sorry. Do we know the venue yet for the 2-day conference?
Yes. I don't know it off the top of my head.
One of the merits, I think.
Okay.
So, but it is in downtown, I do know.
If I know the rules of travel in the state, if you're more than 50 miles away, they provide travel and overnight. So when I was in Senate, they gave travel and overnight accommodation. But if you live in, say, Farmington, then you go back and forth every night.
Okay.
I think it's 50 miles.
We'll give you the list, but yeah, we have a certain amount of hotels. There's a lot of regulations. I'll make sure you know all that. So on the 8th, like I said, we'll sit down and give you all the details. We'll make sure you're doing it right as we schedule these things.
Okay.
So everybody's kind of responsible.
Rex,
Yes.
Way too much. But my experience with NCSL conferences are that it's really good for you to be there the whole time. They start Wednesday afternoon at like 3 o'clock and they have something that evening. They have something all day and then something that next evening. And they go till 3:30, I think, on Friday.
On Friday, yeah.
And it's all substantive.
Yeah. And it's a chance to socialize.
You're going to different NCSL than I would.
I'm a photo. I'm talking about the ones outside of the area.
So again, just for your reference, we did send out a list of when the legislative redistricting committee is meeting, and I will again reach out to Representative Ray and Senator Sandel.
Will they be?
Yes. Oh, you're fine.
Will they be broadcasting also their meetings?
I assume they will. I haven't heard differently, so I expect that it will continue the lessons, the positive lessons we've learned from COVID, that they will continue to do that as well. So please,
Just one thing I
Gordon.
was thinking of, and once we get our legal counsel, I just wanted to, before we go to the conference, there are some specific legislative things that you're supposed to do and not do when you talk to legislators about districting, and you're going to be in a conference where there's legislators just talking about districting. So I'm just telling you, we just want to make sure we're really clear on what that means. I'm not doing that right now, but when we get our legal counsel, we'll just make sure you know what that means.
Terrific.
I thought that we could not talk about lines. Can we talk about other things about redistricting?
I just want them to tell you, but I just want to make sure we're clear on it. They may talk about lines in those meetings, who knows? We don't know.
Well, until we have the numbers, we can't talk about lines. There is one thing, before we go
Please.
through these public hearings, we have talked, and they did also, the two guys talking about it, about not only having our criteria, but prioritizing our criteria. That's still something we need to do before we go out on the road.
Yes.
Especially if you're going to tell people, go ahead and draw some maps and give them to us. But you've got to tell them, this is the priorities you got to play with. And if you can't play with those priorities, it's going to be a totally useless effort on your part.
Yeah.
So we have to make that decision as well, internally with a lot of those things.
So I think that's one of the, that raises, I think, one of the important educational issues that we still need guidance, especially from our legal counsel, to make sure that, not only are we deciding on how important is contiguity going to be. I mean, at some level it's guaranteed, right? But if we're making a trade-off between more contiguity versus less contiguity, is community of interest more important? Is compactness more important?
All those things have to be prioritized.
Yeah. And again, that may be a conversation that we want to have a facilitator actually help us work through as a commission. And so I'm looking towards the later, mid to late June at the earliest, for us to start having some of those more explicit conversations about prioritization. And we may find that we may even want to wait till after the NCSL conference, but I'd like to get us moving sooner than that. But perhaps with the caveat that we say, let's revisit it after we've had the kind of in-depth conversations on redistricting.
So I think just the last item, they've got this schedule that's going to show you what Chairman put together. And you have it in your packet, the actual criteria to start thinking about.
So again, these aren't new. These are the same ones that we've sent out before, but just a reminder of the task before us, right? We've got to draw 3 sets of maps for 4 congressional districts, 29 Senate districts, 75 House districts, 15 state school board districts. So a small task.
369 districts we have to draw.
Some of us were hoping that somebody wouldn't do that math. But in doing that, we've got all of these other standards that we need to be evaluating. Equal population, single member districts, contiguity, compactness, preserving communities of interest, preserving physical boundaries, preserving cores of prior districts, minimizing division of municipalities and counties, achieving boundary agreements across districts, and then the prohibition against undue favoring or disfavoring of incumbents, candidates or prospective candidates or political parties. And then we've got this other set of kind of special criteria that essentially it says you can decide if you want to. And I've heard some sentiment that some of you want to have some adopt some additional criteria that says that we won't use data on partisan political data, party affiliation, voting records, etc. That's one of the things that is different on the legislative redistricting Commission, they have decided to explicitly include where the incumbents are residing as part of their process, so that it's explicit to them when somebody's in or out of a newly aligned district. But again, I'd like us to be thinking about that and for us to start thinking about how we make the case on not using this data and to develop an explicit statement on that. But again, that'll be an action item for another commission meeting. Are there any other issues that members of the commission would like to raise this evening? Commissioner Baker, please.
Yeah, I've got a few, and this will just take a few minutes, I think. Issue number one that's been on my mind for a little while is that of annexations of cities. That is annexations.
So a city expanding its municipal boundaries, okay.
So my thought is that if we draw a boundary along a city limit, and then afterwards, a week later, they annex some land, and we've just chopped their city in half. And so it's something I think we need to somehow watch. The lieutenant governor process is about one a week statewide. So I would estimate that during the line drawing period that we have, we're going to face probably between 5 and 10 annexations, and they may or may not affect our line drawing. And I've thought of a few different options that we could use to address that. We could take no action and not address it at all. But by so doing, we would be rolling the dice that an annexation may cause us to cut a city in half. Second option is we could set a hard deadline, say August 16th. Tell all the cities and counties, have the data that you have at UGRC, the state GIS. On that date is what we're going to use, period. And a third option, and I don't know if this would fly or not, but we could ask the lieutenant governor to freeze doing annexations during the period that we're drawing lines.
Would it be feasible or helpful to simply have the lieutenant governor keep us informed on a rolling basis of pending applications?
It could be. It very much could be. But then we'd have to alter our.
Yeah,
well, not us, but
that'd
cities
shift the
and
burden to
counties.
us, right?
To a degree, yes. So we could just treat it as that. I think that would come under option number one. We do nothing but keep ourselves aware of it.
I guess my concern about annexation, it could be an annexation of 20 acres and projected
Exactly.
100 homes. But they may not be built for 20 years.
Yeah.
It's possible too.
Yeah.
I know we'll discuss, this is not time for an action item.
No.
I firmly feel number 2 is the best option we have. The population rate we have is at a specific point in time. It's already changed by now.
Sure.
But that's the point in time in which the decisions are made. They picking a date saying this will
So
be the
freezing
community
is a
size maps at a particular date. That's what we do. If you guys want to change it afterwards, it's out.
So
That's
the city
on
gets
you,
chopped
then.
in half, and too
That's
bad
your
for them.
problem.
Their
Yeah.
problem.
So, yeah, there's probably going to be between 5 and 10 cities statewide that are affected or that experience an annexation while we're drawing lines at the same time.
Well, and it may well be that, one, if we have the conversation with the lieutenant governor's office and they can communicate to the cities that here's the issue and, we'd like you to start planning.
Yeah, get her
I
done.
think it's going to stop their annexation because of us.
Well, they might be able to move
might
it
hurry
forward. Yeah. Yeah.
Or the argument is, as we do the hearings, this tract of land outside of our city limits is planned for development. And so at least be aware of that as you're trying to draw lines.
We could solicit input from the county clerks saying, are you expecting any annexations in your various cities? And we could also tell them at the same time, it's August 16th is the deadline. Have your data into UGRC because that's the data we're going to use. If you send it in August 17th, too bad. Assuming that we actually get the data on those dates.
Sure. So thank you. Additional issue.
The online comments, you've mentioned, was it UIRC
Mhm.
Have we had any comments?
We've had,
Yes, I'm in charge.
yeah.
I'm curious what they may have.
Yeah, I created a little database just to put this community. I did a brief little. Some of the stuff.
Yeah.
No, you get unedited
So we have had some.
Yeah.
starting to come in. That's why we're trying to think about how to just get some.
Maybe we can come back to that. here in
Well,
just a sec.
It actually, do you mind if I
Go right
ask a
Please.
question? It actually might be useful to have either a summary, or if they're not too voluminous, just have them available to us each meeting on a rolling basis.
Yeah.
So we can keep up with them.
Yeah, and I think that's the
Maybe-
strategy.
Maybe triage.
Yeah, I think that's the strategy that we've been talking about with Gordon and the staff, is that we bring them to the commission on a rolling basis so that you're not getting inundated every single day.
Yeah, we want to.
But Jacob made a little word cloud with some of the words that came in, and you can see maps. Figures heavily. Utah figures heavily, but we'll have other ways of trying to organize this. We're creating a database with all of the comments. So the idea is that if we have a theme that we want to search for and see how many comments have been about Logan or St. George or the Hispanic outreach organization, whatever. We're working on creating the database. This gives you some idea of that, some of those comments.
Right.
Yeah, some of the I put all these comments in. Some of them are more like they want you guys to listen to them, give equal representation when it comes to population, or when it comes to, there's one guy who drew his map during 2010 redistricted, and he thought his map was the best, but it was a blatant some partisan redistricting, so they didn't end up using this map. So yeah, if you guys will take into consideration their voices, what they will say to you when during these public hearings.
Okay. Anything else, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, one last item, and this is the GIS person coming out on me, but as far as getting a GIS team on board here, and I know you guys are varied in hiring other people, legal people and communication people, but where are we with a GIS team?
I'll let Gordon speak to that.
So we have ordered our software. The state had gone through the procurement process. We should have ArcGIS. Well, was that? Anyways, the newest one they have. I'm moving to the site. It should be here next week. The problem we have is we don't have the computers yet.
We don't have
the computers. Computers are not going to be here. However, that runs on the cloud at Esri. So we have a loaner that Jacob's using, and a loaner that Allie's using. We have one more GIS guy that's coming next Tuesday. He does train other people in Esri. His job was to teach it. So he'll start Tuesday. And
so we have hired someone?
Nice. So we're bringing them in. We've been a little hesitant bringing too many in until all the computers show up. Right. They come to their desk and there's no computer. So we're having to find people who are left their computers or working at home, and now we're kind of scratching through the state right now.
You mentioned ARC Pro, and that is a seriously advanced software package. Is that intended for us?
So they have a version that's going to be a
computer.
So Esri is the one providing the public interface. So they're going to bring it to us next on the 8th and show it to us. So we'll have them online, Esri, as well as Citygate. Now, Citygate is the one that the staff's going to use to actually do the mapping. Esri is the one that's going to have unlimited access for the public. So you'll see both of those. But you'll see what the public's going to see in the interface.
But the assumption is that if one of you wants to stay up late and draw lines, that it will likely be the Esri online tool that you would use as an individual. But that any map that is for the commission, our staff will end up drawing using the Citygate Autobound software.
And are we going to have GSI staff?
Yeah, so you will have staff people that can run the GIS. And so what the legislative site's doing, and I think it's a good idea to follow, is that you could sit down with one of our staff whenever you're ready and just work out a map with them, or the details of where you're interested, what focus. We're going to start as soon as the data hits here on the 16th. We're not waiting for a meeting. We're going to start drawing some things and trying to emulate some of the criteria that are given to us in legislation. So we won't start from zero, but you'll have those kinds of maps available, and you'll say this is wrong. This is what we want to see. And each one of you will have a chance to sit down with a staff person whenever you're available to start working through the map that you want to see. And then we'll bring those to I envision we'll bring you together, and then where we're like, we'll be quick other places with a lot of discussion.
How many staff people are we going to have with that kind of capability?
I'm hoping to have almost 10. Because like I said, if we're going to go out into the community and teach people, we're going to burn out our staff if they're going to every event. And they only have to be no. We're going to try to we care about it. We care about each one of our staff. So we want to give them we have a very short window. We just got to hit it really hard. A lot of people, a lot of resources have to be otherwise.
Would the staff consist of 8 employees, volunteers, interns, all the above?
So we're going to have to figure out how we can use interns in that. I'm looking at, or excuse me, volunteers. I'm looking at interns. So we're going to have people that we're going to be paying for interns. They're only going to last till January 1st. And the schools are giving us a lot of opportunity to get those. This is an exciting opportunity for anybody that wants to be in any kind of public anything. So,
And I've got plenty of connections in the local and northern Utah GIS community. I could get the word out if you want.
yeah, if they
But
have
we're
some
looking for interns and volunteers.
that would be really good if you could get that. That's kind of been funneling all the resumes to us. And so if you want to get
So we'll work with you on getting that word out.
What's that?
We'll work with you on getting that word out.
Okay, I envision I could have them say we got
send it to me.
opportunities with the redistricting commission. If
Yep.
you're interested, send a resume.
Yep.
To either of them.
We're now attending slug meetings, so
Okay, don't forget the
That's
NUGIS
it.
meetings.
what's that?
Don't forget the NUGIS meetings.
Yeah, but the slug
NUGIS
meetings
and Northern Utah GIS or Salt Lake.
User group.
User group is the other one.
Okay. All
Gonna
right.
be irrelevant.
I just want to throw it out there.
So, okay.
Okay,
Anything else from members of the commission for tonight? I want to thank you for your comments, and I do want to note that I'm saving the conversation around communities of interest. I know some of you worked really hard to you have detailed notes on some of the readings. Some of you still probably need some more time to digest some of those things. But I do want us to have a conversation around those because I think there were some good ideas in there. And there are also some warnings for us. But I think we need a fair amount of time to dive into the communities of interest conversation. So.
Our legal way, I think that would be the first item.
Please.
I just make a suggestion too. It would be helpful to me if our legal counsel were to sit down and propose an agenda on what items to study, what issues were, rather than just walk into a meeting and having everybody make some suggestion where they're going to go.
Sure. So drawing upon the expertise of that legal counsel. Sure. Thank you.
What do we need to know?
Yeah.
Or the flip side is how to best get in trouble.
And get out again.
So how to get into good trouble, maybe the phrase to use. All right, so if there's nothing else, does anybody have a motion to close?
I just want to say I can feel the momentum starting to pick up. And it feels good knowing somebody's at the wheel. So thank you, and thank you.
No,
Been here 2 weeks now. Now we're gonna.
it has been very nice to have Gordon on board and to be able to have regular conversations with him to just keep all of these pieces moving. So thank you.
And thank you to our AG for keeping us out of trouble already this meeting.
Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. And we'll call the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those articles. Thank you for sending that.
Oh, okay.